Hello and welcome to Her Theology. My name is Cass, and I'm so glad that you are with me today. And what an episode to jump in on, right? Hopefully, if you're listening to this, you will have listened to the first part of this 4-part series. So we're into episode number 2. So in the first episode, I have a discussion, and it's Dr. Megan Best is my guest for all 4 episodes. But I had the discussion with Dr. Megan Best on bioethics in regards to conceiving and having a child, and also infertility. Why is there a rise in infertility now? What are the causes for infertility, and what process do couples have to go through, both emotionally and spiritually, but also practically, if they're facing the diagnosis of infertility? And so Dr. Megan Best gives us a lot of information in that episode. I would highly recommend you go back to that episode if you haven't listened to it, just to get a bit of a foundational understanding of where we're coming from. We do talk about some biblical, we do actually look into scripture about what it means to have a child and to be a parent, and the means for marriage, that marriage's purpose is not just for childbearing. We talk about a lot of that sort of stuff. We talk about the guilt and shame that can also be associated with this diagnosis, and that actually is not, you shouldn't feel guilt and shame. And how do you work through that and know that there is acceptance and love and forgiveness through Christ? So like I said, if you are new to this, please hit pause on this episode and head to that episode just to give you some really good foundational truths. This episode, we hit the ground running because Dr. Megan Best, wow, I'm so thankful and privileged. She actually sat down with me for over 4 hours to conduct these interviews. Crazy, right? And so this episode is like kind of, we stop an interview, we go straight into it. So we hit the ground running. And in this episode, we talk about everything to do with assisted reproductive technologies. So often we will think of IVF. IVF is just one option of many that come under the banner of assisted reproductive technologies, ART. So we discuss what are the options out there and what are the ethical implications you need to consider, along with practically what's involved. Dr. Megan Best also takes us through what it looks like, when we freeze embryos. What do we need to think about there, and where does life start? What are the ethical implications there? And then we also look into sperm and egg donations. There is some risks involved. What is that? What does that process look like? What's the long term that maybe we don't consider when we want to opt for something like that? And so we just really go through, what does it look like that this medical complex, it is a business, what is it actually selling us, and what's the actual truth? And where, as Christians, do we maybe not always go along with the narrative? What should we be challenging and thinking through and questioning? So Dr. Megan Best comes to us with a wealth of knowledge. She has over 30 years experience as a doctor in the palliative care sector. She's an associate professor and convener of bioethics at Notre Dame University in Sydney. And she is also the director of Ethicenter, which I cannot recommend enough. Ethicenter.com.au is a great resource if you are a Christian wanting to think through different medical ethical questions that you may have. And there is a range of topics discussed there, contributors from all over Australia, which are trusted and well-versed in this area. And Dr. Megan Best has also, she's written over 100 publications, but she has also written 2 books, and one of which is Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, which I had around here. But I think my kids have taken off with it. Oh, sorry, it's on my bookshelf, which is a great reference book. I actually think it should be for all Christians, just to help you work through the ethics around life, having a child, and all the options that are out there, everything from conceiving all the way through to abortion, and also contraception, and everything in between, miscarriage, everything is involved in that book. And so I'm really thankful for that resource, and I highly recommend it. Now, if you are new to Her Theology, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Feel free to follow along on Facebook and Instagram. Instagram's where most of the magic happens. Also, if you are listening to this on a podcast platform, please feel free to follow along and subscribe so you get updated whenever a new episode comes out. Leave a review if that's possible, if you've got the time. That would be so helpful. I love it so much when I see beautiful reviews from you all. It's just really encouraging, and it helps the algorithm get Her Theology out there a little bit more. And last but not least is Her Theology is now on YouTube. So some of you may be seeing this. Many of you will be listening to this. Head over to YouTube, Her Theology Podcast, hit subscribe, that bell button, and that way you can stay up to date and be notified when anything comes out. Outside of that, I hope you enjoy this episode. If you have any questions past this episode, please feel free to email me, hertheology@gmail.com, and I will be able to point you in the right direction. I probably can't give you answers in regards to this, but I can definitely point you in the right direction and try and get you some further support if you need that. So bless you. Enjoy this episode.
We're going to get stuck straight into right now IVF. So we talked a little bit about IVF in the last episode, but let's now look at what is the process of IVF. And as we go through what is the process of IVF for a couple, what are the ethical, what's the right way to say this, ethical implications we should consider in regards to each process of the IVF journey?
Okay, well, IVF stands for, well, thank you for having me.
Oh, yes, thank you. Sorry, Megan. We've gone straight from last episode to this, so it feels a bit like, but thank you, Megan, for joining.
IVF stands for in vitro fertilization. In vitro means in glass, which is referring to what we always thought was a test tube, but is in fact a petri dish in a lab.
Right.
And eggs from the woman and sperm from the man are put in the little glass, the glass bowl, and we wait for them to get together to see how many embryos form through the fertilization process, where the sperm goes through the wall and enters the egg. Then a procedure is undertaken where, and one of the embryos, one or two, will be put in the uterus of the woman, who's been given hormones so that she's at the stage of her cycle where she's ready for an embryo to implant. And we hope that the embryo will then continue to flourish in that environment. One full cycle of IVF takes 2 or 3 weeks. And it's part of a group of technologies which are actually called assisted reproductive technologies, or ART. So if I say ART, I'm not talking about paintings on the wall. I'm talking about this bigger group. So IVF is just one of the techniques available within assisted reproduction. And we now have many procedures. You can have IUI, where sperm is injected into the uterus. You can have just hormone treatments. There are more specialized procedures, GIFT and ZIFT, where you bypass some of the IVF. You just have sperm put, directly in place to get them closer to the egg. ICSI is where the sperm is actually injected into an egg if it's not strong enough to do the trip by itself. But the big area of growth in ART is actually genetic screening of embryos. The classic test is called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where one cell is taken out of the embryo and it's examined under a microscope to see what its DNA will show. And it might be screening for particular diseases. And then the embryos with the preferred characteristics are kept and the rest are discarded. After the first transfer, the rest of the embryos are typically frozen and then transferred one at a time over subsequent months. The problem is that there is no calculation which tells you this many embryos will lead to this many live births.
Yeah.
Because there are so many factors that can influence whether or not the embryo develops. So in the interests of doing everything they can to ensure that the couple will have a child, often parents are encouraged to create as many embryos as possible, maybe over 20 embryos for one couple. So then once they have the child that they want, or they stop IVF for whatever other reason, there may be some leftover embryos. And that is one of the big ethical problems, is this fact that there are so many human embryos discarded through IVF practice. And it's I think that the number one problem in a Christian going into IVF is the need to protect the lives of your embryos. In the last session that we had, we talked about what the Bible teaches about the value of every human being in the eyes of God. And we do have a God with a heart for the vulnerable.
Absolutely.
And it matters to him what happens to these little human beings. So we need to be very careful. And that is not the attitude of people in the laboratories. We also talked last time about different rules that have changed about whether or not an embryo outside the human body needs to be treated carefully. Generally, no, it doesn't under our law. So if you're a Christian and you're going into an IVF clinic, you need to be prepared to fight for your embryos. And that can mean you're a bit of a troublemaker because you'll be going against the flow. Because the other thing they do in IVF labs is when they see all the embryos you've got, they only want to transfer the ones that look the best because they want the best possible success rate, not only for you, but also for their own stats.
Yeah.
So they'll discard any embryos they think don't look promising. So you need to fight for your embryos. Sorry?
Would they tell you, or is there a chance that they would just discard it and then just say, these are the ones
well,
we
if you don't say up front, I want all my embryos transferred, they may well discard it without mentioning it to you.
Yeah. And when you're saying transferred, that means, just for people that are new to this, it's not saying they're all transferred at once. It's saying
one at a time.
One at a time they'll be transferred, and it means you're committing to, say 12 were fertilized, you're committing to trying 12 times, if that was your decision, and transferring each one. Is that fair to say?
As your cycle comes around. We can talk about the options of what to do if you do have excess embryos, but I do think Christians need to learn about the process in advance, because if you don't realize the procedures and you suddenly find yourself with 20 embryos,
that's my point.
That's a bit of a shock, and you are better off knowing in advance.
Absolutely, because I have heard of that happening, where people didn't realize how many would be fertilized, and now they have the dilemma of, do I need to try to conceive, like have this transfer happen? I could potentially have 12 kids. They're things that just weren't discussed. And I just want to touch on quickly, for those that are just hopping in on this episode, you mentioned in a previous episode as well, Jesus came to us as an embryo. He was fertilized in his mother's womb. And so understanding that, and the weight of that, and life is precious, and God has created it in certain ways to be this way, understanding then that how that impacts, I guess, these decisions going in. Like, we actually need to be educated and well informed before we go into the process. And I want to say this, like, I actually think it's our responsibility as Christians to feel the weight of that, the sense of responsibility in that, and to not be naive walking into these sort of situations, because it can be very easy to do that, because you are heavy and emotional and you're desperately wanting to do anything you can to have a child. But we still need to assume our responsibility in understanding what the process is. So that's why we're exploring that specifically now. So I guess we talked about, like, there's the options for someone going through IVF where the sperm's inserted and things like that, where it's all kind of happening internally, and it's not the Petri dish situation of an embryo being fertilized.
Well, no, it's the ICSI's done in the
it is
in the Petri dish. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So what would be some of the, other considerations we need to think through in regards to these procedures?
The basic issue is discarding of embryos, but it can happen in different ways. As I said, genetic testing is
that's a big one.
It's being promoted in Australia as something that some people would like every single pregnancy to undergo.
Like, are you talking outside of IVF as well?
Well, yes. But that's another whole conversation about the screening in normal pregnancy, which is a huge.
Jodie and I talked about it in Bringing Forth Life episode.
Oh, did you? Good.
Yeah,
yes,
we did talk about that.
Yes, I remember chatting to her about that. That's a huge problem. But in IVF, it's being encouraged very widely. And the whole premise of the screening is that if you find embryos with characteristics you'd rather not have in your child, you discard those embryos. And if you aren't aware of the reason for the screening in advance, you may not realize that the intention is just to work out which ones to discard. So that's really a process. Christians need to think carefully about, do you want to undergo screening if the only reason for it is to discard embryos? Because the thing about genetics is just because you have a particular gene doesn't always mean you're definitely going to get that illness. So it's an increased risk rather than a diagnosis of a problem in many cases. There are some genes that are screened for where if the individual does get the illness, they won't get it till adulthood. So are we saying the first 60 years of life isn't worthwhile if we're going to discard embryos for an adult onset illness? So it's there are so many problems, and the whole idea that a human being is less valuable just because of the genes they have is not a Christian notion at all.
That's what I was just about to say. We view and value life by a certain standard, which is not what Christianity is about. We value all life, regardless of what it looks like, and we love people and meet them where they're at. And some of the most beautiful people I know, I mean, that's like we talked about in the episode, over 80% of pregnancies terminated with the high risk of Down syndrome. I'm like, have you met anyone with Down syndrome? They're the most beautiful, wonderful people in the world. Like, we would do well to have more. So I'm like, they're wonderful. And so it's a sad reality of the world we live in now, is that we do play God in making these decisions and feeling like we have, the fact that we've been given the opportunity to ordain whether life is of value or not is something we should really consider as Christians. I don't think it's something we should be participating in at all, if I'm being frank.
And at the same time, this is another space where Christians need to advocate in the public square that if some parents are discarding their offspring because they think that it's difficult for a disabled child in this world, well, why don't we try and change the way the world is rather than discard the child?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
So given that this whole industry is around finding the best embryos, I do think Christians need to go in thinking we're going to use all our embryos. And so you need to think, well, how many children are we prepared to have? Not all your embryos may result in a live birth, but if they are all good embryos, how many children are you willing to have?
Yeah.
And let your clinic know and stick to your guns and be very difficult. And some clinics are prepared to accept patients with strong ethical views and accommodate them, and it might be worth a bit of shopping around and asking, we're Christian, are you prepared to accommodate our views before you start? And there are some Christian IVF doctors, so that will, if you can find one, that will help. But if you do find yourself with excess embryos, your options are, some people just think it's too hard and don't make a decision and when they move, the clinic can't find them to pay the
Yeah.
fees for the freezer, and they're just discarded through lack of contact. That's not ethical for Christians. Some people just keep paying storage forever, but in the end, nothing will happen to those embryos. So that's a problem. What clinics often have done in the past is just allow the embryos to thaw, so they die and they're discarded. A lot of clinics these days encourage couples to donate the embryos for destructive research.
Oh,
So all those options are a problem because it results in death of the embryo. And I do think if we create embryos, and they're so precious to us when they're created, they deserve a chance at life.
absolutely.
So the two ethical options for Christians are to either use the embryos yourself, and I have also counselled couples with more embryos than they expected. You only need to transfer one at a time. You don't have to think, I'm going to have all these children. Just do it one at a time and see how you go. They may not all take, but that's certainly an ethical option. The other one is to relinquish the embryo to another couple. And there are some couples who don't have, one or the other doesn't have egg or sperm, and they can't create their own embryos and would be willing to look after someone else's embryo from very early on and raise that child as their own. So it's just a very difficult situation to be in, and it's so much better to just avoid it by understanding where you are in advance.
I've got two questions on the freezing. So one on freezing and one on adopting embryos. The first one is freezing. Do we know the long-term ramifications from freezing life for a certain period of time? Like, is there any evidence to show? Because I feel like this is still relatively new in the big scheme of things, right? So we're talking about ethically, and life, but what does it actually mean for these little humans that are frozen on ice for a long period of time? What do we know? How do we know that that's a right thing to do or a wrong thing to do?
Well, I don't think we do. It's a really strange space to think about philosophically. A frozen embryo, it's human life, because we know we can defrost them and they can grow into human beings.
Yeah,
they could grow into adult human beings, and they're not dead. Which, when we were having all the newspaper coverage about embryo research, it was so strange seeing all the things people would call, saying they're not human, they're not alive. I mean, well, if they're not human and they're not alive, what are they? But some people avoid IVF because they have a big problem with freezing human beings. And I think we have to recognize that some people are opposed to IVF because of the freezing. And some clinics will just do fresh transfers where you have a live embryo and transfer it, maybe just make one or two embryos and transfer them, and you don't have any extras.
Okay.
There are some advantages to that because the woman doesn't have to have all the hormones to produce the excess numbers of eggs.
Right.
And so it's safer in some ways. It seems to be more natural.
So
and I think you do have an increased success rate. Sorry?
That sounds like a really good option actually for Christians.
Yes, and some people are saying this is the way IVF should go because it's much easier for the woman to cope with than being hyped up on all those hormones. So that's certainly one option. Some people by the way, are opposed to IVF because so many embryos have been destroyed over the years in developing IVF. And there is embryo wastage. They use human embryos since those laws were passed in Australia to allow the use of embryos in research. Human embryos are used for quality control and training of technicians in IVF clinics, and they are all destroyed. So some people say, I think this whole industry is ethically troublesome and they choose not to go down that route. And I think that's fair enough.
Yeah.
But for the people who say, well, I'm going to look after my own embryos and make sure I'm not personally responsible for any embryo wastage, they then have that choice. Well, do I want to find a clinic that just does the fresh transfers, or am I prepared to freeze my offspring? I spoke to one grandmother not long ago who felt very uncomfortable that her grandchildren were all frozen.
Yeah.
So it is a strange thing.
Yeah, and
to
that's the
freeze
thing.
human beings.
There's a lot of people impacted, right? Do we have any data? Like, do we know how many in Australia are frozen at the moment? No.
I'm not aware of anyone who keeps that data, but there are
okay.
hundreds of thousands of them around the world in freezers. Very large numbers of frozen embryos. And it was the huge number of frozen embryos that first prompted scientists to start saying, we want to be able to experiment on these embryos for other things other than IVF. Because they're all there, they're probably all going to die, so we might as well get some use out of them before they die. And that's the ethic of the end justifies the means. So they're going to die anyway, why don't we get some good out of them before they die? Which all is based on the idea that there's nothing special about a human being. We're not made in the image of God, we're just an accident of evolution. But that's a very common mindset in our community, and that's how the whole legislative changes came about to allow experiment on human embryos. Look, some babies are born from embryos that have been frozen for years and years. To my knowledge, there haven't been long-term studies looking at the overall outcome for IVF children.
Okay.
Certainly there's increased risk of premature birth with its risks to the mother with IVF pregnancies. There's some evidence that if the infertility was due to a problem with the man's sperm, the male offspring may have similar problems. So in some way, some of the technology we're using to overcome problems in a couple may be perpetuating those problems in the human gene pool.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
It's yes, I haven't seen any good long-term studies looking at the outcomes for IVF offspring. So when you think about it, the first IVF offspring is still alive. So it's still early days, but certainly a lot of IVF children appear to be just the same as all the other children. And there's so much IVF going on in Australia now. It's thought to get your head around how many, it's about one per classroom, one IVF child in every classroom across the country.
Wow.
So there are lots of them, and you wouldn't know if someone didn't tell you. So
I don't walk down the street and go IVF, not we don't
if
know.
there are any differences, they're not terribly obvious.
Yeah, I was just curious to see. I as a non-academic, not medically trained or anything, I'm like, there's got to be some sort of impact freezing lives for so long, right? It just seems so foreign and strange. That's why I was asking that question. But like I said, I have zero backing for that.
Well, whether or not it's fresh, the transferred embryo is fresh or frozen, does change the success rates of the procedure.
Okay.
So with a fresh embryo, the likelihood of having a live birth ranges from 7 to 50%, depending on the age of the mother. With frozen embryos, it's 11 to 38%. So up to 50% with a fresh embryo, up to 38% with a frozen. So it does make a difference to the likelihood of survival. So there must be some impact at that stage very early on.
Yeah.
those figures also remind us that most women who go into an IVF clinic will not come out with a child.
I think that's a really important note to push back on. We talked about this. This is a industry. It's a business, and
Doctors don't run most IVF clinics. In sort of corporations run them, and they're interested in profit.
And they've got marketing. It sounds really horrible, but I've seen their marketing. It is so
Beautiful.
misleading.
It's beautiful marketing.
Yeah, well done. Babies. Completely well done. But I get so angry because I'm like, this is so misleading, because they're focusing on 1 in 3 will make it, or whatever your chances. But I'm like, if we flip that messaging around and
it's not 1 in 3.
Yeah, or I remember this is years ago. I saw an advertisement and they're like, 1 in 3 will have a baby, and I'm like, hang on, that sounds really promising and great, because we probably, when we're in that state, we don't consider flipping that narrative around and going, hang on, and what you were just saying then, up to a 50% chance. So 50% even potentially higher chance that it won't be successful.
Well, the 50% are under 30 years old, and most people going to an IVF clinic are not under 30 years old.
No, that's true. So it's even less. So that's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking how deceiving and misleading it is, to be honest. I think it's horrible.
Well, we hear the stories, the happy stories of the 45-year-old movie star who gets pregnant, but we don't hear of all those other women who month after month are on the emotional roller coaster thinking, is it going to be this month? And then they start bleeding and they know it's not. And it's
heartbreaking.
It is so hard.
Yeah. And the toll it takes on marriages and just everything. I for any women listening, we just sympathize completely, and and that's why we want to talk about this, because we also want to help women and men prepare for that journey, but also to understand all the implications that can come from that, and what that might mean for them emotionally going on that journey as well. Makes me emotional thinking about it, because it's just going alongside people on that journey. It's hard. It is so hard, like you said.
And I think when we start thinking about, how should a Christian think about this? These are other issues we need to think about. Is that infertility challenges our self-image, our sexuality and relationships. Once you're diagnosed with infertility, you can be on a roller coaster that lasts for at least months and probably years. Yeah. And this can create a lot of pressure within a marriage. We certainly know that there's an increased divorce rate for couples going through IVF, because there's a real loss of control once you're in the infertility cycle. Because I don't know about you, but when I was having children, I was probably more aware of how sovereign God is than any other time in my life, that there was nothing I could do to control what was happening in terms of whether or not I got pregnant. So we have the marital stress, where every conversation seems to be about infertility, sex changes because you're trying to make babies. And so there's some very good books recommending how to cope with this. That you limit conversation about infertility to 20 minutes a day. That's mainly for the husband, so that he can talk to his wife about other things. Have some days for lovemaking to build intimacy, and other days where you just get the job done because you have to have sex because you're the right stage of the cycle. Yeah. And separate them. So you protect part of your marriage from the infertility journey, so that you can continue to build your marriage.
I will link those book recommendations in the episode notes as well. I'll get them off you later, Megan, and I'll link them for all our listeners if you need to find them.
There's the emotional stress of infertility. I don't know if people remember the story of Hannah, the mother of Samuel in the Bible, who was so distressed that Eli, the priest, thought she was drunk.
Yes.
In the temple.
Yeah.
But it is, because it threatens so many things. I mean, one thing when you're thinking about having children, it's not just the immediate, it's all the dreams for the rest of your life about the children you hope to have. And when you're threatened with infertility, all those dreams are threatened as well. So it has a huge impact on your life. And there's financial stress. IVF is very expensive. With some of the procedures, it may be quite costly for you financially. There's spiritual stress where you can lose your sense of contentment in God's provision and start to doubt whether God is good. And I think as Christians, we need to think, how much of my life am I going to dedicate to IVF treatment rather than other ministries? That we need to be good stewards of all the things we're given. And I think as Christians, how we use our time is also ethically significant, and we need to think about that as well.
Yeah, I agree. So this brings me to my other question. So looping a little bit back to frozen embryos and adoption, which I think will probably lead us to our next topic on surrogacy.
No, we haven't done donated gametes yet.
Oh no, okay.
I haven't.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask with the adoption, or like do you want to? Well, how about you talk about donated gametes first? Explain what that is, maybe.
A gamete is an egg or a sperm.
Okay. So yes. Okay. So so is that legal in Australia? Are you allowed to?
Yeah.
You can donate, but you can't be paid for it. Is that correct? That's what the difference is between here and the States and whatnot.
Yes.
Yes. So it has to be donated, an egg or.
Our USA is one of the least regulated ART areas in the world.
They're wild over there.
And if we read about what happens in the States, we might be misled. The laws in Australia are much stricter. Yeah. And a lot of those make it a safer procedure as well.
Yeah, great. That's good to know. Okay, so yeah, talk us through maybe the donating of the egg and sperm.
Well,
egg or sperm.
Okay. With after the development of the original basic IVF with the egg and the sperm in the petri dish, more and more techniques have been developed. And as they've been developed, it means that the potential of one's genetically related child started to become a possibility for some groups in the community who previously had never thought it would be possible. So a couple where either the husband or the wife is infertile, but the other one does have eggs or sperm. And so there's a chance of a child that's genetically related to one of them. Yeah. Male homosexual couples are increasingly using some of this technology in association with surrogacy for men to have a child who's genetically related to one of them. And single people, it's called social infertility if you're single and you want to have a genetically related child. The introduction of donated eggs or sperm started to become available. And so in a way, the technology is driving the demand rather than the other way around. And older women whose eggs may not be very healthy may use the eggs from a younger woman. And there is recently a law changed which allows the two eggs to be combined, which is probably beyond the scope of our discussion because it's very technical. But the younger woman's egg may be able to result in a pregnancy where an older woman's egg may not for genetic reasons.
Right.
So we have this situation where the male sperm are collected just through masturbation usually, and that has ethical concerns as well, how the sperm is collected. Women generally are given hormones, and then the eggs are collected through a minor surgical procedure. The collection of sperm has no health risks really for the male, but the use of hormones to collect the eggs in women have resulted in occasionally in death, but are also associated with things like cancer. So there's in the States where it's unregulated, and a lot of college girls are being tempted to donate eggs through thousands of dollars of payment. It's a bit of a scandal, some of the health risks they're being exposed to for this. And there have been some very sad stories of girls who have even died through donating their eggs.
Oh, it's just treating
So
women.
it's not
like
a trivial
commodity.
procedure to donate eggs. It is done successfully for many, many women, but not always. So we need to keep that in mind in terms of the ethics as well. But the problem for a Christian couple is as soon as you introduce donated eggs or sperm, the one flesh of marriage, which is a Christian principle for marriage, has been interrupted.
Yeah, that's a good
And
point.
even though a woman may become pregnant with another man's sperm through the injection in a very surgical environment and no adultery has taken place, men have described sexual jealousy, seeing their wife pregnant by another man. There is an imbalance to the pregnancy once you introduce donated gametes, which I think Christians need to think of carefully. I think childbearing needs to be seen as a joint exercise at all points, particularly in the case of infertility, where it's so easy to start blaming one or the other for being the problem.
Yep.
So we want that unity. Unity in marriage is such an important Christian principle that I would think anything that threatens that unity needs to be thought about very carefully. I wouldn't go, it's hard to know. Is it ethically absolutely wrong? I certainly wouldn't recommend it. I certainly don't think it's wise. But you need to think about receiving gametes in terms of those problems of threatening one flesh. But also, if you receive a gamete, that means someone else has given it. When we look at what parenthood means in the Bible, it's more than just providing eggs or sperm. The model of parenthood we see in the Bible is about bringing children up, raising them to adulthood. And if you donate your gametes and to someone else, you are foregoing your responsibilities as a parent. So I think we also have to think seriously about giving gametes, and I think it goes against the teaching of the Bible to donate your gametes to another couple. I think there will be some situations where the donor may be very closely involved in the raising of the child, where I think there's, I can think of one or two issues where, no, actually I can't.
Because I was going to say, I have heard of like a sister donated her egg because it was like family, so therefore it was kind of, the child would look kind of similar, and that was their
yes,
reasoning.
And that's common. And in gay couples, the brother or sister of one of the partners donating the egg or the sperm so they can have, both partners genetically represented. But if you're not the legal parent, you can make decisions that might be ethically troublesome for the donor. Like, what if it's found that the child has Down syndrome and the birth parents decide to have an abortion and the donor hasn't got any say in that?
Yeah.
It might be the mother smokes through pregnancy or drinks lots of alcohol, which affects the baby. And then, for the rest of their life, they're able to make decisions that you may not agree with. So you are not fulfilling your role as a parent in the same way. So these are ethical considerations I think need to be considered very carefully.
Yeah.
I understand why people do it, but I think often the emotional factors kick in without us thinking this through. And ethics is a very rational thinking process. You need to do it carefully, to just think, well, what are the implications? It's not just the joy of seeing my sister pregnant. It's what happened in, I'm giving up this responsibility as a parent for the rest of that child's life.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. And also I've heard of this happening where then the parent who say it was a dad, sperm wasn't working, so then they got a donated sperm, where the dad feels like they can't connect with the child because the child doesn't look anything like them. It's clearly not of their gene pool. He or she.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's that as well, that it can cause.
Well, I think that's the
long-term
breaking of the one
relational.
flesh. Yeah.
Yeah.
It does. It certainly does impact the relationship
Absolutely.
in some cases.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's in the spirit of Scripture.
Yeah. And I think that's a really
there are
good
no
way of saying it.
absolute prohibitions, but it's not in the spirit of Scripture.
And I think I really like that it's not in the spirit of Scripture, because the reality is if you look up Bible verses on IVF or fertility, you're not really going to find anything. We're looking at this in the whole of Scripture and understanding what God's good plans and design and purposes were for man, and then arriving at these conclusions, knowing what God has purposed, and what He deems is good and wonderful.
And that's true. And once we start saying, well, I'll do anything to have a child, you're pushing God's sovereignty out of the picture, and you're not trusting that He knows what's best for you.
Yeah. And that's what we touched on in the first episode is a child a right, or is it a gift from God? And that's really hard to hear when you're in that season.
Absolutely.
But it's something that as Christians we need to flesh that out. You need to be in community, talking that through with people you can trust, people that know the Word of God well, that can disciple you, that you can push to and fro against on this. Where do I stand? Where do I land? Where's the conviction? Where's the biblical understanding about life and children and families, purpose, all that sort of stuff? And where's my identity wrapped in? What all of this plays into that question of, is children a gift or are they a right? And I think as Christians, we look to Scripture and we see that they are a beautiful gift. And as we're fleshing this out, I can see more and more we just keep playing God. We really do. Like it feels very, the industry just seems to be playing God so much in so many different ways within the medical industry and outside of that as well. But in particular with this.
The other side of it that often isn't considered is the impact on the offspring. And donor offspring have been very vocal in that in some jurisdictions still, but for a long time, the donors would be anonymous. Now, we know that the majority of children born from donor offspring are never told by their parents. There's nothing on the birth certificate. There was one father removed from a birth certificate in Australia, and the wife's lesbian partner's name went on the birth certificate. So there's nothing on Australian birth certificates to say you're born from donor offspring. So there's nothing, the child won't know unless someone tells them. So that's one problem, and I think that's related to shame people feel if related to infertility in our society. But there's been a lot of complaints by donor offspring that they have identity confusion. They want to know their biological origins, and they're very frustrated that they can't discover it. In some places now we have registers of donors' names, and the donor offspring can access that information once they're 18, but you only access it if someone's told you that you're the result of.
And if your donors decided is registered on there, and yeah. Wow.
That's right. And there are now cases of incest where
Yes, I've heard of this. Blew my
there are
mind.
some sperm donors in some countries who've had dozens and dozens of children. And there are cases now where they've been, you know, sexually joined. There seems to be some sort of a bond, which, you know, is natural in a family in a way.
Yeah, like,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's happening there, but that they've actually. I haven't heard of any offspring born, but I certainly have heard that there's been incest, unwitting incest from half brothers and half sisters of the same donor without realizing it, only finding out about it subsequently.
yes.
And there's a sense in some donors' offspring say they feel like they were abandoned at birth by their biological parent, which comes back to even, you know, this is not coming from Christians, but this is coming from children saying, I feel like my biological parent abandoned me. And that really shows how God's ideas for how we flourish most successfully are the right ones if a child feels that instinctively. And, you know, why are we surprised? We know that adoptive children always wanted to know their biological origins. What made us think that that donor offspring wouldn't want to know their biological offspring as well? So,
and I think
still in some countries it's all anonymous, but in New South Wales the details are kept now.
Yeah, they are. Okay, that's good to know. I mean, yeah, and this is exactly what we were kind of touching on last time as well, is we don't know the long term. We're starting to learn all this stuff because it is still a relatively new technology and it's changing so quickly, but it is still relatively new in the scheme of things. And so therefore we're only learning now these ethical dilemmas that are coming out of it. So,
but it does remind us that the whole IVF industry is there to give parents what they want. And the principle of thinking what's in the best interest of the child is not primary in people's thoughts.
But I would say that messaging translates across most of the medical industry when it comes to women and pregnancy and contraception. It's the consideration of what all these decisions are is never in consideration of what is best for the child. It's what's best for the woman or the couple, not the child, which is not how we should be thinking as Christians. We should be thinking of the lives that are there, that have been created and knit wonderfully in the womb. Yes, so I know you are tight for time. We're hitting 12 o'clock and we haven't even touched on surrogacy yet.
No.
But so maybe we might need to do more episodes. We can go into surrogacy because that is just a huge topic in and of itself. And that seems to be one that, my goodness, I feel like I'm hearing of it more and more and more in Australia. I know it's quite big in America. I know I have American listeners, and so I like predominantly Australian listeners, but this is a global reach, this her theology. And so I do want to acknowledge that surrogacy is really big in the States because it's a business. You can be paid to be a surrogate and whatnot. I'm not sure what the laws are around it here in Australia, but I know I have seen, I'm hearing more and more of people becoming surrogates for family members or good friends or whatnot. So it's something that I really want to touch on and talk about and flesh out. So we might do that in another episode, Megan, if that works for you.
That would be lovely. Yes. There are a few things we haven't touched on.
Yeah. But yeah, so is there anything else before we wrap up that you want to talk about in regards to IVF specifically?
Well, I think to finish, when I was writing my chapters, I've written multiple chapters around these topics. It's such a big topic. But when I spoke to couples who'd been through the IVF journey, I would always ask, what do you know now that you wish someone had told you before you started? And the most common response I had was, I wish someone had said it's okay to stop trying. And it's very interesting that when the Australian government first introduced subsidy for IVF, they used to allow payment for 6 cycles. And that gave people a natural stopping point. You try 6 times, and if it didn't work in that time, you'd stop. And talking to specialists, they said, well, if a couple's going to get pregnant through IVF, they'll probably get pregnant in the first 6 cycles. And so the doctors were quite happy with that system. But now the government has made it possible to have subsidies indefinitely. And I think while people appreciate the generosity of the government, that in a way has created a problem in that people have to decide for themselves when they stop. And so people were saying, I think you need to think about how long you're going to do this before you start. Because it's so hard once you're on the roller coaster, and women feel so emotional on all the hormones. And as I said, you're so emotionally vulnerable when you are desperate to have a child, that if you can think about it before you start and write down your reasons, because you'll forget what they are when you're in the midst of the treatment.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And don't think of it as giving up. It needs to be thought of as a very proactive choice to stop this, to make a decision, to finish this stage of your life, so you don't feel like a failure. But you need to be realistic, as we've talked about the success rates. The success rates are not good. And if you can make a positive decision about how long you're going to try and then you're going to stop, that is very helpful. And realize that there are other ways to build a family. We've spoken about the need for foster parents. You can be spiritual parents for children within your church. But there will be grief. You're not just giving up the hope of a child, you're giving up all your dreams of what your life would have looked like with children. It's very hard and it's very sad. It might take time to recover, but some people also feel relief that they don't have to keep trying anymore.
Yeah.
And that struck me very powerfully when I heard so many people say that to me. So I just like to make sure I say it today.
No, that's great. That's really helpful. And there's support, right, for those that are on that journey and making that decision as well. I know I have a friend that goes to a support group. Even now, 15 years down the track, she meets up with these women that have all decided the same decision, and they all go through that process, and they go through the ups and downs together. And it's really wonderful to see community that's built around that specifically to help those individuals that are going through that as well. So
yes, social media can be great. It can be very difficult for people who are mourning the loss of a child. And we need to be sensitive in our churches about this, and on Mother's Day and Father's Day.
Yeah.
I discourage people from just, giving a chocolate or a rose to a mother. I think everyone should get them. Everyone's got a mother, even if they're not a mother.
Yep.
It's so easy in our family-focused churches to exclude people struggling with infertility. We need to be mindful that there might be, we might not always know what's going on. We shouldn't make assumptions that it's through choice, and we need to be sensitive to all those, and all the single women who would desperately love to be a mother and haven't had the opportunity.
Yeah. I think that's something I'm hoping. I've been seeing a little bit of progress in the church on that sort of side, so that's been promising and good.
That's great.
And it's been a rebuke for me as well, because I fall into the trap of saying silly things without considering what people are going through. So the more we talk about it, the more aware we become, and the more we can be gentle with it and approach.
Well, good on you for bringing up the topic. I think it's something we should talk about more.
Absolutely. And thank you for coming on, Megan. It has been a true blessing for us as the church, as women, men listen as well. I always talk about my women, but they're out there. Thanks, guys. Yeah, I really appreciate all your time. So I highly recommend listeners, please buy Megan's book, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. You can get it.
Yeah, Kurong stocks
Kurong.
it, but Matthias Media is the publisher, and they'll
Okay.
always have some in stock.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And it's great to support Matthias Media. So I love their work. Megan, thank you so much for coming. I will also link any recommendations or books, resources as well, along with your website, Ethicenter,
Thank you.
and some of the work you've done. I highly recommend, again, if you want to learn more about this or maybe go down some other avenues in regards to ethics, you can definitely check out Ethicenter. Is it ethicenter.com? It is. Yeah. Okay, great.
And if anybody's in the middle of ART treatments, in the book, I go through every single procedure and talk about the ethical implications. People in IVF are highly educated, so they'll be able to understand the text.
Fantastic. Okay, that's great. Well, thank you for listening, everyone. If you found this episode helpful, please like, subscribe, send it to your friends. I'd actually say the best thing you can do is if you think you know someone that might be going on this journey, just send it to them. Say, I just heard this. It might be helpful. It might not be. And it'll hopefully point them to more resources and support as well. Anyway, thank you for joining us. God bless.
Bye.